Valerie is going to moderate a panel discussion, on technology things that really are useful to almost everyone, even though you might not think it, especially when it comes to Izzy talking about spaceports. You say, man, do I really care about spaceports? Well, maybe you do, and you just don't know it. But we'll find out what's going on with the technology here at Midway Toastmasters as Valerie leads us in a panel discussion on technology. So without any further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to Valerie. Valerie, enlighten us.
Thank you, Charlie. Good morning, and welcome to a panel discussion on drones, spaceports, and GPS, the growing influence of aviation and aerospace technology on our everyday lives. My name is Valerie Salvin. I'll be the moderator for today's panel. I'm an instrument-rated private pilot, and I hold a basic ground instructor certificate from the FAA, or Federal Aviation Administration. I presented free pilot safety seminars as a volunteer FAA safety team representative for 5 years, and I've written articles for Plane and Pilot magazine. Our distinguished panelists today, in the order we'll begin discussing their topics, are Arlene McMahon, who's a pilot and professional flight instructor. She helped over 1,000 student pilots and fledgling flight instructors fulfill their aviation dreams at Aerotech Inc. Flight School. In 2009, she received the FAA's National Certified Flight Instructor of the Year Award. And that same year, she received the Award for Excellence in Pilot Training from the National Air Transportation Association. Arlene is an aviation safety speaker and author whose books include Train Like You Fly and The Flight Instructor's Survival Guide. Our second panelist is Izzy House, who holds a Master of Science in Digital Marketing and a slew of academic awards to go with it. She's a marketing expert and self-described space nerd with over 20 years experience in public affairs, outreach, and marketing. Izzy recently authored Space Marketing, Competing in the New Commercial Space Industry. Now she's working on a new book focused on marketing spaceports. It will discuss bringing Kentucky into the space industry with its own spaceport to provide a hub for industry, research, and education, draw corporations to the state, and grow workforce opportunities. Our third panelist, Charlie Monette, has decades of experience as a pilot, professional flight instructor, flight school owner of Aerotech Inc., and FAA designated pilot examiner, or DPE. He's also an electrical engineer, having worked at International Business Machines Inc., otherwise known as IBM, before moving to aviation full-time. I'm thrilled that each of these panelists agreed to participate in this event. I'm a fan of aviation and aerospace topics, and I'm convinced that the technology associated with aviation and aerospace is more important now than it's ever been in our history. We'll spend about 10 minutes on each topic, but we might move back and forth between the topics at times, and the panelists have been encouraged to have some discussion with each other as we go along. I'll be keeping track of the time, and I'll nudge things along if that's necessary. Most of all, I hope you'll enjoy the next half hour as the panelists talk about some technologies that affect our lives every day and that will help shape our future. Please type any questions you have for the panel in the chat box. At any time during the discussion, I'll be monitoring the chat box, and we'll try to take some questions as we go along. We're going to begin the panel discussion with the topic of drones, which are also known as unmanned aircraft systems, or UAS. Arlene, I know you have some thoughts about the usefulness of drones. Could you start us off by telling us how a neighbor's drone helped you with some home maintenance recently?
Thank you, Valerie. You know, it's long past the point when I'm excited about climbing on a ladder and getting on the roof of my house. But after a recent storm, it seemed to me like I might have had some roof damage. These days, calling in someone to do a roof estimate is a bit difficult. That's when I got the idea of asking a neighbor friend who happens to be a drone pilot to fly over my roof and take a close-up look to see what damage there might be. Unless you've actually seen one of these things working, you just can't imagine how useful and how impressive they really are. My friend stood on the ground using his remote control with a little joystick, move the little joystick around to fly and hover exactly to the point that I identified on the roof. There on his console was a screen about the size of a small iPad, and I could see exactly what the drone was looking at through his camera. Up close we got, closer we got, the drone even landed on the roof, giving me a bird's eye view of exactly what the damage was. I was so impressed with that. I began to get curious about other uses of the drones, and I've been amazed to find out how big it actually is. As Valerie said, I am a pilot, and as a pilot, I can already fly a drone, but it never occurred to me that I might actually want to do it until I saw the many benefits of drones. I was really surprised to find that farmers use drones to do surveillance of crops, to look at irrigation, to look at damage. I was surprised to find that they use drones in search and rescue, taking these things to places that might be hazardous for people to go into after tornadoes, after earthquakes. The drones can fly. They're very maneuverable into small places where people wouldn't want to go unless they knew the drone had been there first and then it was safe to do so. The drones, they range from very small to very large. The smallest drone is about 1/2 pound. The largest one, of course, probably being flown by the military right now to do all kinds of reconnaissance and munitions for the military. But drones these days, I thought this was a new thing. No, these things have been around since the 1950s. The first one was actually flown in 1951. But it's only been lately that the technology exists to make them really useful for what we might want them for today. Cameras for surveillance, GPS for precise navigation to exactly where you wanted to go, memory cards to store data and photos, and even lights for night flight. You know, these days anyone can purchase a drone on Amazon. For less than $100, you can get a starter drone. But they're not toys. The propellers on these drones, and there's usually more than one, they rotate at more than 10,000 RPM and can be quite hazardous. Some drones do require registration, I found out, and sometimes you might actually need a drone pilot's license, otherwise known as an unmanned flying license. This requires passing a test from the FAA. As of 2019, which was the latest facts that I could find, there were over 1.5 million registered drones. And this includes more than 1 million recreational drones and 400,000 commercial drones, as well as over 170 licensed drone pilots. So as you can imagine, drones, they are here to stay. They have changed our society and they will continue to change our society. Already we have Amazon talking about dropping off prescriptions and merchandise right to your door. Can you imagine how you might use a drone. And I'd like to leave it there for just a minute and let some other panelists chime in on their areas, and then we'll talk a little more later. Back to you, Valerie.
Okay, just one quick question. What keeps all these drones from running into each other or colliding into people, or what's in place? What kind of regulations prevent that?
Well, like every other flying thing, drones are controlled by the Federal Aviation Administration, otherwise known as the FAA. And yes, there are rules and regulations. One of the rules has recently been changed somewhat, but it generally says that a pilot must keep his drone within eyesight. The next one is their cameras allow the drone operator to see what's in front of the drone, and that camera is maneuverable in 360 degrees. There are other drone technologies out there that keeps one drone separated from the next, giving the operator a warning on his console when two drones are getting close. Of course, there are also regulations that say that drones don't fly very close to airports and other restricted areas. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, and I believe they're supposed to stay away from people as much as they can.
Absolutely. Stay away from anything that might cause a hazard. Of course, you would never fly a drone over a stadium full of people. The national parks have even outlawed drones because when you go out there and you're wanting to enjoy Bambi and nature, you certainly don't want to be hearing the hum of drones. So there are a lot of restricted areas where you don't fly drones. Washington, D.C. would not be a good place to fly a drone. And even over your neighbor's house. Let's face it, there are some privacy issues, and your neighbor might not be very happy if you're flying over looking into a swimming pool and what's in his backyard. So be neighborly, be nice, as Bruce Willis used to say, and pay attention to where you're flying your drone, and don't push the boundaries.
Okay, thank you, Arlene. Spaceports as well as airports might be using drones, but moving on to areas, moving on to Izzy's area of interest. Izzy, how are drones used in space?
Well, when it comes to space, it is a very dangerous place to be for humans. We don't survive very well when we get too far outside the atmosphere. We need oxygen, we need our ecosystem, we need food, that sort of thing. So drones are a perfect entity to put in situations where it is dangerous for us, on planet and off planet. Drones, they do all kinds of things. Like our most famous drone right now is Ingenuity on Mars. It has done several flights, so many more flights than they anticipated. It is gathering information. It's sending back valuable data about the landscape of Mars. Inside the ISS, we have two drones. We have the Astrobee system, which is NASA's little drones that carry things from one end of the ISS to the other. It also gathers information. And JAXA, the Japanese partner up in the ISS, they have this little cute ball with eyes that monitors the astronauts and gathers information on the astronauts, so they don't have to. It gathers visual information, it gathers things that they're doing, and it is very useful. Now, when it comes to developing an ecosystem, we have to take all of our ecosystem with us, and that's the most exciting thing about space, is that all this technology that goes into building this ecosystem comes right back down to Earth. For example, bees don't do very well without gravity, but we kind of need bees in order to be pollinators when we grow our own food. So they've developed these little drones, these little tiny drones that are robo insects that go from and pollinate in space, the plants. And it even knows how to jump from one plant to the other. It's got sticky bottoms and takes the pollen with it. Well, with our situation on planet where our bee populations are being reduced, this particular technology can go and help us, help the farmers on planet pollinate their plants. Drones can be used for research. They can be used for building structures. We have 3D printing drones that will be building our habitats on the moon. We have all kinds of repair type of drones. They're developing drones that will go and repair satellites, which, you know, that's a major thing. We have all these satellites up in space that are difficult to repair. And we don't have the manpower to do a moonwalk or a spacewalk every time we want to repair a satellite. So these are little drones that can go and do that. It's very exciting what the drones are doing. They can do manufacturing as well. Our robotics on the ISS is another technology that has come down to prosthetics here on planet. We have developed real robots that do things, and now we have limbs that will do things for people that have had amputees. It is very exciting.
All right, we'll move on to spaceports a bit now. Izzy, tell us about spaceports and how are they different from regular airports?
Well, a spaceport focuses on space. And in my vision, serves as a hub for all the things that will take us to space. It will launch satellites, obviously, but there's two different ways that it can do that. You have horizontal launch and you have vertical launch. Vertical launch are the big SpaceX rockets. And we can't do that here. That has to be done over desert or water. We just don't have an ocean in Kentucky. But there's all kinds of other ways that we can launch satellites. We have technology. You can convert a passenger jet with a rocket on their wing, fly up into the atmosphere as far as it'll go, and then shoot it off from there over the ocean. Planes can get to the ocean pretty quickly. We also have balloon launches and glider launches. So you can launch a balloon up into the stratosphere, and then from there, launch the rocket. And then you have gliders that will also go all the way up to the stratosphere, and then they can launch a rocket. The satellite industry was worth $366 billion last year. That's almost $500 billion just in satellites. And this year, they're expected 107,000 more satellites to go up into the atmosphere or up into the orbit. So and we have 5 space stations that are getting ready to be deployed up into the orbit as well, which will need all kinds of support. And as a hub for space, we don't necessarily have to launch the rockets to support the rockets. My vision is to be near the Ohio River and be able to use the waterway from the Ohio down to the Mississippi into the Gulf to get the payloads to where they need to do on the coastal launches for the big rockets. We can support launch services. We can do research. We can build the technology here in Kentucky that takes us to space. And a spaceport, another valuable part of the spaceport is there's this aircraft called supersonic suborbital jets. They use the atmosphere to go 14,000 or 17,500 miles per hour, and it will enable an aircraft to go anywhere in the world in 1 hour. That will need an infrastructure. That needs the same thing that a big jet will need. It needs a longer airfield, about 12,000 feet and 200 feet wide.
Now, Kentucky already has some links to the space industry at Morehead University, and then there's a couple of companies, I believe. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Morehead is doing some exciting things right now. They are getting ready to go on the first Artemis mission to the moon, and they have a payload called lunar ice cubes. Space Tango out of Lexington is doing some amazing work. They are coordinating with Lambda Vision, and they build artificial retinas in space. One of the things that space does for us down on planet is all these medical miracles that we live with every day. We don't even know comes from space. For example, the diabetic strips that test sugar, that came from monitoring the astronauts on the ISS. But they're building these artificial retinas that will enable people to see. In space, you can finely print in such detail that you can't do on planet. Like, it's like printing with water, and it just collapses on itself here on planet. The proteins that are needed to be developed are cleaner up in space than they are down here. So, and then we also have Tech Shot outside of Louisville, which is now Redwire. They've been bought out. They are 3D printing human hearts. Can you imagine taking your own stem cells, which comes from skin now? We can use our stem cells from skin, and building a heart that our body will not reject. They've already had miniature ones that beat. It's amazing. What will that do for us here on planet? And that's just one example. COVID, the vaccine that we have for COVID came from develop our research on the ISS on building vaccines. It's just mind-blowing, the medical research that is happening in space right now.
Okay, just one more question I've got, and then we'll move on to Charlie's segment. Has there been any interest from the Kentucky state legislators or from our senators or congressional representatives in building a spaceport in Kentucky?
Space for Kentucky has not been on anybody's radar until recently. I created a report that showed the potential for this industry. Right now, like I was telling you, 366 billion just in satellites. It was worth over almost $500 billion last year. They're expecting it to be worth $1.5 trillion by 2030. And that's a very conservative estimate. It could go Forbes magazine said that it could be worth about $14 trillion. And that is the gross national product for a country, just in the industry, just by the end of the decade. Now, when we had Aerospace Day back about a month ago, General Rob Givens, the state director for Rand Paul, he gave a talk, and it was about space. It was about developing space in Kentucky. So there is definitely some legislative interest out there, and a lot of them now have my reports. So I anticipate a lot more in the future.
Thank you, Izzy.
Yeah, Izzy, if you get a chance, you keep using the term ISS. You want to explain to everyone what ISS is?
International Space Station. My apologies.
Well, spaceports as well as airports host vehicles that use GPS. That brings us to a topic that Charlie has worked with extensively for years. Many of us have used GPS to navigate in cars, but what is GPS, Charlie, and where did it come from?
All right, Valerie. Yeah, GPS is a fascinating thing because it's probably one of those technologies that's directly affected almost everyone. We're all using GPS, and almost no one knows what the heck it is and what it does and where it came from. But it affects almost everyone's everyday life and things that we do. But let me just give you a brief history of the GPS system. Of course, GPS stands for Global Positioning System. And what that means is it's just a form of figuring out where the heck you are, at its simplest core. But it was developed as a system for the military, for military navigation. And for a long time, it was restricted only to the military. And it was only in latter years that they decided, well, maybe we'll share this with the rest of the folks in the world. And the way GPS works is there's a whole array of satellites, 24 of them, circling the Earth constantly. And they're sending out signals. And what your receiver does, either in your airplane, your car, your phone, as long as it can hear 4 of those satellites, it just compares the time that it took for each one of those signals from those satellites to reach you. And it does this incredible calculation that says, okay, if this satellite took this long and this satellite took this long to reach this point, this is where that individual or that operator should be. And that's how it uses that timing of those signals to calculate exactly what your position is. And it's a miraculous thing. And as I say, it started out with the military, but then the military decided, or maybe the rest of the world decided that, wait a minute, this is too useful to restrict just for the military. So, and I don't know the exact year, but it had to be back in the 1990s, the late 1990s, where they suddenly made GPS system available to the civilian world. But because this was a proprietary system, they kind of restricted it. So if you used it on a civilian application, they threw some things in to mess up the signal so you could only be so accurate. They didn't want you to be doing precision navigation with their system. Well, again, as it became more ubiquitous, pretty soon that restriction came. And so now we have virtually no restrictions on what we can do with our GPS signals. But let's think about this and how it's affected everybody's life. Now, we in aviation, we were the early adopters of GPS navigation because that's what it was built for in the first place. But what has it done for aviation? It has made aviation so much more efficient. For instance, in the old days before GPS, when an airline or any airplane went from point to point, they would follow a whole series of ground-based navigation systems. Okay, and they would have to zigzag around the country following these established airways. With GPS, we don't have to do that anymore. You can plug in where you started, where you want to end, and it just calculates you a straight line to go to that destination. Well, what does that do? That makes it much more efficient just to get there. So from the airlines, there's already big savings in the fact that they can reduce the the miles that they fly just because they don't have to zigzag around going to these navigation aids that are on the ground. On top of that, I say they go on a straight line, but the courses, especially on the longer flights, they don't go in a straight line. They follow what we call a great circle arc around the world. And the GPS navigation actually navigates someone using a great circle route. And a great circle route over the face of the Earth is now the shortest distance that you can go from one place to another on the globe. So what it's done is made just the act of flying the airplanes much more efficient. Plus the fact that, if you remember the old days when we used to have to kind of calculate where we were going to be and when we were going to be there and make a good educated guess of when we were going to get there. Now, as a pilot, you know every instant of where you are. And you're able to project right now exactly when you're going to get to your destination, because there's a lot of variables with weather and wind and everything, but all of that is factored into the calculations in your GPS navigator. It takes all the mystery out of navigation for the pilot. You always know where you are.
Thank you, Charlie. We're near the end of our time, and we've got a question from Dario about drones we'll get to in a minute. But would you touch on quickly about how GPS is helping to forecast earthquakes or even tsunamis?
Sure, we can do that. You know, one of the things that, because of what we do, is we can now supplement the signals from the satellite, because there are variations in atmospheric propagation for satellite signals. In order to get absolute precision, now we have ground stations that say, okay, if we could just correct that signal just a little bit, because I can hear my ground station now, and I know that there's a variation in signal, I can now navigate, pinpoint navigation. I'm talking within inches, whereas before we were talking about meters. Now, one of the ways that GPS, the odd ways, other than just plain old navigation, is used, and again, in answering your questions, one of the ways that GPS is being used is to measure the movement along fault lines where earthquakes can occur. And because you can put a GPS receiver on each side of that fault, and because of the precision positioning, if that fault line, if that earth shifts an inch or so, which would indicate some movement in there, that GPS receiver can actually detect that signal and say, oh, wait a minute, this is actually moving. And what's going on here? And as far as, and then if you're some earthquake specialist, you can predict that if the earth on this side of the fault is moving this way and the earth on this side of the fault is moving this way, there's going to be an earthquake sooner or later along this fault line. Another way that it does that, it's around volcanoes.
Okay, I think we're at the end of our time, Charlie, so we'll need to move along with that. We're into the question period now, so we're going to need to back up a bit on another topic, but thank you, Charlie. And the question we have from Dario is, how many accidents have the drones had with commercial airplanes? I'm not sure we've got figures, but panelists, would you like to weigh in on that?
I can help out there a little bit, Valerie. We did have a couple of accidents with the military back in the early 80s when they first started out using drones on regular missions. It took a while for the operators to figure out how to keep drones separated. Now, Dario's question was about commercial. And back about 5 years ago, there was an instance where a drone actually collided with it's called a King Air. It was used in commercial operations. It's a small aircraft, it's a small airliner. There was no damage of consequence. It didn't result in a crash or anything like that, but it was an incident as they report it. So these things are something that the FAA is very cognizant of and of course wants to prevent. So as something like that happens, that causes everybody to go back and reflect, what could we do differently so that that doesn't happen again? And the good news is they did do a lot of reflections and they did make some changes. So there hasn't been any further collision with commercial carriers. We had a couple of small collisions with a smaller aircraft. One was a balloon, and I believe another one was a Cessna 172. But luckily, there have not been any reported collisions in the past several years. So we're really hoping we've made some good strides there for future safety going forward.
Thank you, Arlene. And do we have any other questions from the audience? I'm not seeing anything else in the chat box. So it looks like we're nearing the end of the question period time we'd allotted as well. So this will conclude our panel discussion on drones, spaceports, and GPS. Thank you for logging on to the discussion, and thank you, Arlene, Izzy, and Charlie, for sharing your thoughts and expertise with us today. We hope those of you in the audience will be able to stay online to hear some dynamic speakers talking about other subjects in the next part of our meeting. At this time, I'll return control of the virtual lectern back to the meeting Toastmaster, Charlie Monette.